All right, first of all, last week we were looking at Hezekiah's prayer and how Hezekiah says, look, God, I've lived a pretty good life. I've been faithful to you. I've been righteous, so please heal me. And I pose the question, is it okay to appeal to God when we pray on the basis of our own righteousness? Now, what I want to clarify, I went for a run Thursday morning. Now, I'm not as avid of a runner as our pastor, but I did go for a run Thursday morning after we met. And sometimes when I'm running, I'll reflect on what I taught or studied the previous day. And it occurred to me that I should probably clarify one thing. I am a Christian, and as a Christian, I believe that when we approach God in prayer, the basis for our confidence is not our own righteousness, but what Christ has done for us. Okay, that's the basis of our confidence. In the lesson last week, what I was trying to do is also show you that there is a biblical pattern for if we feel like we're suffering unjustly, that we can be honest with God about that and tell God about that and ask Him to correct the injustice. And I think that that's an acceptable biblical thing to do. However, as a Christian, the basis for our confidence is always what Christ has done for us. If I were to say anything other than that, it probably would mean that I'm not a Christian. Literally, that would probably disqualify me as a Christian if I say that we can approach God in any other way than through Christ's blood. But I did want to encourage you to think a little differently about prayer too, or supplement your understanding of prayer by thinking of being honest with God about injustice and when we experience it. So that's all. Any questions about that before we move on to Isaiah 6? All right. Today we are going to do Isaiah 6. And as I've been doing in previous weeks, I want to throw out a discussion question for you guys to discuss briefly in groups. Oh, before I do that, I said this last week, but if you do miss a week of the study and are just dying to know what I said, then you can find it on YouTube. Here's a question for this week. How do you imagine God? When you think of God, whether you're praying to God or you're just thinking about God in some other context, what is your default setting when you picture what God looks like, perhaps, or who He is, or you think of God's nature? What attributes of God are primary in your mind? Which attribute of God does your mind go to first? Perhaps without even thinking consciously about it. How do you imagine God? Now, I'm going to give you a couple of other questions to help you, or maybe to spur your thinking a bit about this. But for now, why don't, in your groups, at your tables, discuss very briefly how it is you imagine God. All right, let me give you just a couple more questions to get you to think about this in a different way. What do you call God when you pray to God? Do you call God Father? Do you call Him Lord? Do you call Him God or some other title or name? And what does that signify? Why do you choose? Perhaps that's just how you heard someone who was influential early in your Christian life praying that way. Why do you call God that? And what are the theological implications? What does it reveal about what you're assuming about God when you talk to God? Another question. What's your favorite worship song? When you praise God, what is it you like to praise about God? So if you go to the contemporary service, do you like singing about running into God's arms? Do you like to sing about angel armies? Bless the Lord, O my soul. If you go to the more traditional service, do you enjoy Holy, Holy, Holy? How great thou art. Great is thy faithfulness. What is your favorite song to sing to God? And what does that reveal about what you assume about God that you're not perhaps even thinking consciously or what you are thinking consciously about God? So go ahead and continue your conversations, but maybe introduce these questions into it. We could probably talk about these things for the rest of the time, but I want to talk some too. So I'm going to bring us back together now. Is there anyone who would like to share some of the things they said in their conversations with their group? That's great. We do have some early Christian testimony that the Apostle Paul looked like that, but I don't know that we have any ancient sources that say that God looked that way. And it probably wasn't his appearance. It was probably more his character that made you, yeah. Great. Anything else? Anyone want to share their least favorite worship song? Let's not do that. Let's not do that. Good. Jesus Messiah? Good. That's a nice theologically loaded song there. Great. Anyone else? There's no real right or wrong answer to this. I mean, I suppose there are some wrong answers out there, but I'm sure that you guys didn't come up with any of them. The Bible has a lot of images that it uses for God. And there are a lot of attributes of God that are all equally true and worthy of our worship and praise. And so my guess is, even though each of you had a slightly different perspective on God, that none of them are wrong. The reason I wanted to introduce the topic in this way is because we're going to get one perspective on God that the prophet, I almost said the apostle, that the prophet Isaiah saw, or that he shares with us. He has a vision of God and sees God. And I wanted you to think about how it is that you view God. So when you look at Isaiah, how he does, that you're able to see, oh, that's a little different from how I normally think of God. And so perhaps I need to supplement my view of God with something more along the lines of what Isaiah has. I need to add that to my understanding of who God is. So I wanted to start off the conversation that way. Today we're doing Isaiah 6. I did decide to divide Isaiah 6 into 2 different weeks. We're going to do verses 1 through 7 this week, which is merely the report of Isaiah's vision, what he sees and what happens to him. And next week we'll look at the commission that he receives when he's having this vision of God. But this week we're just doing Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. Let's start with verse 1. It's a passage that's probably familiar to most of you. One of my favorite in the Old Testament, although I probably say that just about every week. Isaiah 6:1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. So first of all, this vision, let's get some of the basics out of the way. When did this happen? That's right. The year that King Uzziah died, which was, we don't know for sure, sometime around 738, maybe as early as the late 740s BC. More scholars these days are leaning towards 738. My guess is that's not all that significant. I don't know that there's anything theologically significant about the time that King Uzziah died. This is probably just an important event in Isaiah's prophetic career. This may be the very beginning of his prophetic career, for that matter, and that may be why he gives us the date of it, because it's such an important thing that happens to him. But that it happened this year as opposed to another year may not be all that significant. Now, a little more significant is the location of this vision, or this encounter with God. By the way, when I say vision, I don't mean to imply that Isaiah just saw God, but God really wasn't there. Now, it is something that he sees, but it's not just a vision. It's actually an encounter with God. He doesn't just see God, but he's actually touched by one of the seraphs later. So this is really happening. He doesn't just see these things, but he even feels them and hears them. And so this is something that's really taking place. Where is this taking place, though? Good. The temple. Which temple? Jerusalem. That's the only temple on earth that we know of at this time. Now, some scholars have suggested that maybe this is happening in the heavenly temple, and somehow Isaiah has a vision of heaven or is caught up to heaven. I don't know that there's anything in the text that suggests that. It's not impossible, but apart from really good evidence that that's the case, I think that the assumption we should work with is that this is the temple that is in Jerusalem, the one that Solomon built. All right, what does Isaiah see? He sees God seated on a throne. Now, what do we know about God's throne? What you may not be able to tell from your English translations is that the throne is high and lifted up. Now, your English translations may say that God is high and lifted up, and that's not impossible, but a more likely translation of the Hebrew is that it's, in fact, the throne that is high and lifted up. God has a throne that is really high off the ground, in other words, which implies what about God? He's above. He's above, good, he is above everything, and he's not a little guy. This is a big God, and we'll look at that in a moment. First of all, what do we know about God's throne from the Old Testament? God was said in the Old Testament to be enthroned above or on the cherubim. So 1 Samuel 4:4 is just one of the several passages that mention this. It says, "So the people have sent to Shiloh and brought from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim." Now, the word cherubim is the plural of the word cherub. So a cherub, if you have more than one cherub, you have cherubim. That's why you have these words with these im endings in the Old Testament. What is a cherub? Now, God is not sitting on top of little babies. Okay, that's not what God's throne looks like. It's not some little baby in a diaper with curly blonde hair. I don't think that's what Isaiah has in mind here. A cherub was some sort of hybrid creature, very likely. Ezekiel describes cherubs in the first chapter, then again in the 10th chapter of Ezekiel, where you have these creatures with 4 wings and 4 faces and wheels beneath them. Other cherubs seem to be animals with wings but human heads. So this is a sphinx from Egypt, which has the body of a lion, the face of a human, and wings. This seems to be what's in mind, or something like this, when it talks about cherubs in many Old Testament passages. Here's another hybrid creature, this one from Babylon, and actually Assyria in this case, I apologize. And here you have a bull's body with wings and then a human head. The cherub creatures in Israel perhaps resemble the Egyptian ones a little more, because from this area of the world, these sorts of images more often have the lion bodies than the bull bodies, but it could have gone either way. We do have bulls used in temples at this time. When Jeroboam builds the temples in Dan and Bethel, as we read about in 1 Kings, he puts bulls in each of them. So this could be a bovine figure rather than a lion figure, but it's some sort of creature that has wings and a human head, is what most scholars say about the nature of a cherub in several Old Testament passages. Now, when Moses built the items that were going to go in the Holy of Holies that we have talked about in the latter part of Exodus, it says that he puts inside the Holy of Holies, he has 2 cherubs. Now, what we have, the Holy of Holies is shaped like a 30 by 30 by 30 cube. 30 feet by 30 feet by 30 feet. And there are 2 cherubs in it. Each cherub has 4 wings. 2 wings stretch 7.5 feet one way toward the side of the Holy of Holies. Then it has 2 wings that stretch toward the center. It's about 7.5 feet. So each cherub has a wingspan of about 15 feet. Then the other one's wings do the same thing. Their wings touch in the middle, and then the other wings extend to the other side of the Holy of Holies. So if you have 2 there, they're stretching out their wings toward the center, touching each other, and their 2 wings that they stretch backward touch the side of the Holy of Holies. And this was supposed to be or to symbolize God's throne. These guys would have been about 15 feet tall. So when Isaiah says his throne was high and lifted up, this is the seat of the throne is about 15 feet off the ground, give or take. So this is a very high throne, and God is a big God who sits on it. The other thing that Isaiah mentions is God's robe. And what he says is that the train of God's robe fills the temple. At least that's probably what most of your translations say. Does anyone have a footnote, though, or a little study note when it comes to the train of God's robe? Him. Yeah, is that the ESV that says him? Yeah, that's probably a better translation. I don't know how well you can see this, but here's some pictures of some Israelites. We looked at this a few weeks ago, or a couple weeks ago. This is the Lachish relief where Sennacherib has come in around 701 and destroyed and captured Lachish. And these are the Israelites, or the Judahites from Lachish who are going into exile. And at this point, they're bowing before King Sennacherib, asking him for mercy and clemency. And you see what they're wearing. They're wearing roughly ankle-length robes. We don't really have any evidence from this period of people having trains. It's not like a wedding dress that you have this long train that extends behind their robes. So this is probably talking about the hem of what they're wearing. And then you have the king here, Sennacherib, seated on the throne, which is relatively high and lifted up, I guess. You see it's his feet aren't on the ground. He's up a couple of steps. And his robe also comes down to about his ankle, even though he's seated. So the idea of God's train filling the temple, that's probably not the case. It's probably just saying that the hem of his ankle-length robe fills the temple. These are the sorts of things that kings would wear at this time. And I think that the point is that God is so big that here he is seated in this Holy of Holies. He's on a seat that's 15 feet up, and his body extends, the remainder of his body extends to near the top of that, I assume, the 30 feet high thing. And then he has his feet on the ground, or perhaps propped up on the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant is sometimes called the footstool of God. But then you have the bottom of his robe that comes down to about his ankles, and it fills the entire room. And that's what Isaiah says that he sees. The point of this is God is big. God is not the same size as we are, not God as he appears to Isaiah, at least. What else does Isaiah see in God's presence? Verse 2, above him stood the seraphim, each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. Okay, seraphim, that is, again, the plural for seraph. What is a seraph?
Cousin of a cherub.
Pardon me?
Cousin
Okay, it's a cousin of the cherub, right. Okay, it's not the same thing as a cherub. A seraph is called a seraph, a cherub is called a cherub. These aren't all different names for the same thing. One typical answer that you might get if you ask someone what a seraph is, they'll say, well, it's a kind of angel. Well, maybe. An angel is a messenger. Is a seraph a messenger? Maybe the heavenly realm is a little more diverse than that. An angel is one thing, a seraph is another thing, a cherub is another thing. And so this is a seraph that we're talking about here. Now, what may surprise you is that we actually do know what a seraph looks like from the Bible. We have seraphs mentioned elsewhere in the Bible, but not with respect to the presence of God. Isaiah 14:29 uses the word seraph. It said, for from the serpent's root will come forth an adder, and its fruit will be a flying, fiery serpent. Now, the underlined expression there, fiery serpent, that's actually one word in Hebrew, and it's the word seraph. So a seraph is a kind of snake, or kind of serpent. In this case, one that flies, which is also what we have in Isaiah 6. You have this creature with wings that's flying. Isaiah 36, you have the word seraph again. From where come the lioness and the lion, the adder and the flying fiery serpent? Again, the word seraph is the word translated as fiery serpent. So a seraph is a flying snake. Now, you may be waiting for the punchline here. No, this isn't a joke. This is really how the word is used in Hebrew. A seraph is a flying snake. Why would you have a flying snake in God's presence? Aren't snakes bad? Well, the ones I've seen are, and I claim Genesis 3:15 and kill snakes any chance I get. Or I'll be honest with you, I actually scream and run away and hope someone else kills the snake later. That's more accurate. But snakes weren't always bad in the ancient world. Of course, you have the serpent in Genesis 3. That's not a good serpent. You have Satan, who's referred to as a serpent in Revelation 12. Also not a good guy. But you have a serpent that Israelites look at, this bronze serpent, in order to be healed, that God instructs Moses to make. So serpents aren't always, sometimes they're positive figures. Here we have an illustration from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which dates back to around this time. And you have a snake there with wings, don't you? So this was part of the iconography. These were part of the images people used and worshipped, or these images that people believe represented the supernatural realm back in ancient times. Now, is there any problem in this text with saying that a seraph is a serpent? Is there anything that's inconsistent with what we know of serpents that's in this text? Okay, good. Yeah, this would have to be a different kind of serpent, wouldn't it, than the one that tempted Eve in the garden? Yes?
Well, the serpent is represented here as standing.
Okay.
Got wings that are covering his feet.
Okay, the serpent has feet. I have not seen a serpent with feet personally. I guess I would scream and run away, and then it would run after me if I did that, which would not be. That sounds like I'm going to dream about that tonight. I better stop thinking about that. I'm not a snake fan. But this serpent has feet, which is strange for a serpent. However, not in the ancient world. Here we go again, the Egyptian Book of the Dead. You have a bird, you have some other sort of animal here, you have some people, I don't know enough. I'm not going to even pretend like I know what's going on here. But you have a snake with legs. I do know that. A snake with legs. It's a cobra. You can tell by, I don't know the term for this part of the cobra that fans out, but it's a cobra. The hood? Hood, yeah. So you can see the hood of this one. And Egyptians like cobras, and they would have cobras around the thrones of kings, and now not live cobras necessarily, but they would have these images. That was from Egypt. This is actually the Ishtar Gate, which is now part of it's in Berlin and part of it's in London, but it's from Babylon originally, from the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, this is a picture taken from far away, but you can see that looks like a bull-like figure in some cases, a horse in others. But I want you to look at this figure right here. It actually repeats. So this animal here, this creature is the same as this creature. But what I'm going to do is show you a close-up of this particular creature here. I can use the pointer. So this creature here, up close, looks more like this. So it's a serpent's tail and body, at least with scales, and head with the serpent tongue. Then it has the front paws of a lion, I think, and the back legs of a bird. Is that what it is, an ostrich? Maybe, okay, ostrich feet. Sure, why not? We'll go with that. But again, we have a serpent with legs. Now, one other picture. This is back to the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Here you have a serpent with wings and legs. These were creatures or beings that were supernatural beings in ancient theology. And in Israel, now the theology of Israel, in this case, happens to be correct. It's in the Bible, and so we can believe it. But in ancient Israel, they believed that such creatures were around God. You have serpents, they called seraphs, with wings and feet. So what did the serpents, or what did these, if you want to call them snake angels, you can. I like to call them snake angels with students because it just sounds weird. Some students want to say it's a dragon. If you want to call it a dragon, that's fine. Dragons are sorts of serpents with wings and feet. But what are these seraphs doing? In particular, what are they doing with their wings? Okay, they have 6 wings, right? 3 pairs of wings. With 1 pair of wings, they're flying. I would be pretty upset if I had 6 wings and couldn't fly with at least 2 of them. That would be the fun thing to do with the wings, I assume. But with 2 wings, they're flying. With 2 wings, they're covering their faces. Why are they covering their faces? Good, so they won't see God. Isaiah is going to be worried in just a moment because he sees God and he realizes even the seraphs can't look at God. And for him as a human to see God creates some problems for him. So 2 wings they fly, 2 wings they cover their faces. With 2 wings, what do they do with the remaining 2 wings? Cover their feet. Why do they cover their feet? Yeah, we do have that in Exodus where Moses is instructed to take his sandals off because he's on holy ground. This isn't exactly like that. Here they're not taking anything off of their feet, they're actually covering them. And their feet probably aren't even touching the ground if they're flying. But that's possible. That's the other place in the Bible where we have feet mentioned in God's presence.
That big bowing and humbleness. You have to bow to cover your feet.
I suppose so. Yeah, I'm not sure how big their wings were and how they would have what position they would have had to be in to cover their feet, but perhaps. The way this is normally explained by scholars, and I think it's persuasive myself, is that feet here, although literally feet refer to this part of your body, from your ankles and below, feet may be a euphemism for just the lower body in general. And if this is the lower body more generally conceived, not just the very bottom, if this is the lower body more generally, then it makes a little more sense why the seraphs would cover their feet. They cover their eyes so that they won't see God. They cover their feet so that God won't see certain parts of them. There are other texts, I won't look at these, but there are other texts where feet may be used in this way euphemistically. For example, in 1 Samuel and seems like one other passage, maybe it's Judges, when someone goes to use the restroom, it says they go and cover their feet. And Saul goes into a cave when he's running from David. You probably are familiar with the story where Saul goes into a cave to use the restroom, and David has a chance to kill Saul, but he doesn't, King Saul. But it says he goes into the cave to cover his feet. He goes into the cave so no one will see him when he uses the restroom. And we have other texts that seem to use feet in this euphemistic way. It's a nice way of saying that he's covering these seraphs are covering those parts of their body that would be inappropriate to expose in God's presence. Think of Adam and Eve as well. After they eat the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, they realize they're naked. Then they hear God walking in the garden. What do? They hide. They hide in the bushes and they cover themselves. Now we often say that they're hiding because they're ashamed of their sin, but what the text actually says is, Adam says, we're naked. We need to hide ourselves. They're hiding so God won't see them naked. And so this seems to be something that nakedness is not appropriate in God's presence. Even seraphs, even the holy angels, don't look at God themselves, nor do they let God see them naked because that would be inappropriate. What else do the seraphs do? It says, one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. So what do we learn about God in this verse? He's holy. And the fact that they say holy 3 times may mean that he's really, really holy. That's how that's often understood, that you repeat it 3 times because God isn't holy, just holy. He's very, very holy. What else? I'm sorry?
He's the best holy.
The best holy, right. Good. What else do we learn about God?
That his creation reflects his glory.
Good. Creation reflects his glory. The whole earth is full of his glory. This would explain why the seraphs are behaving in the way they do, covering their eyes, covering themselves up. God is holy, and they have to behave appropriately in God's presence. It says in verse 4, it says, and the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. So if you're imagining yourself in Isaiah's situation, you see God, he's huge, sitting on this throne that's very high. The bottom of his robe fills the entire place where they are. These seraphs are there, these snakes with wings, 6 wings, and they're saying, holy, holy, holy. The earth is full of God's glory. What else do you experience there if you're Isaiah? What stands out to you about what they're saying or how they're saying it? Loud. Very loud. Have any of you ever been to a rock concert? Anybody been to a contemporary Christian music concert? Sat near the speakers? Have you ever been on the road and someone pulls up next to you in a car and it makes your car rattle because of the bass in their car? Have you ever been in that car that's making the other car rattle? In my teenage years, I think I was in that car a couple of times. It wasn't mine. I was riding with friends, and it's that kind of volume. It's rattling the doors of the temple, which are not small doors. These are very large doors, and and it's rattling them. What's actually being rattled here is the threshold, probably not the best translation. The way doors would work back then is there would be a stone on the bottom and a stone on top, and there would be a hole in the stone that didn't go all the way through the stone, but I don't know what the technical construction word is. But then there would be a peg in the door that would go into that hole, and there would be one at the top, and it would rotate on that. And that's what's shaking. The door, the thing that holds the door in place is shaking in the stone. These big wooden doors, perhaps with metal overlaid in these stones. And this is shaking because what the seraphs are saying is so loud. Apparently one of them speaks at a time. One of them says, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, the whole earth is full of his glory." Then the other one says it back, and kind of, "We got spirit, yes we do, we got spirit, how about you?" And sort of back and forth sort of thing. And they're so loud that it's shaking the door of the place. It's filled with smoke. The train is filled up. God's right there, and there's not a lot of room left in this place for Isaiah. So he must be up really close to it, and it's shaking. And you can imagine how he might be frightened. Verse 5, "And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." Here we learn more about God, don't we? What does Isaiah call God in this passage? God is the King, seated on his throne. That makes sense. We could have already surmised that based on the fact that God is seated on the throne. But here Isaiah calls him explicitly the King. And what else does Isaiah call him? Okay, Almighty Lord. The Hebrew is Lord of hosts. Now that gets translated in some English translations as Lord Almighty, but Lord of hosts is probably a better translation. And it refers to the angelic hosts. It may have a military connotation. These are the angel armies that the song talks about that I mentioned a little early. God is the Lord of angelic beings, of a large number of angelic beings, angelic soldiers. So he's the King and the Lord of angel armies, so to speak. And Isaiah is frightened. Why is Isaiah frightened? He's seen the King. Now, what's wrong with seeing the King? Okay, good. It says he has unclean lips. Now, we have a number of texts. I didn't put these on the PowerPoint, but there are a number of texts in the Old Testament that speak of people who see God and they're worried that they're going to die. Samson's parents, for instance, see God and they don't realize that it's God. And once they realize that they've seen God, Samson's father, Manoah, says, "Oh no, we're going to die." And Samson's mother or mother-to-be says, "Wait a second, God isn't going to kill us. If he wanted to kill us, he would have done it by now." There are other passages in which people see God and they're worried that they're going to die. Let's see if I can think of another example for you here. In Zechariah 3, there's a story about Joshua the high priest who enters God's presence and he nearly dies as a result. The same thing happens with Gideon, I believe, who sees God and is worried that he's going to die. Moses, when he's looking at the burning bush, and then the angel of the Lord or God speaks to him from the burning bush, Moses looks away once he realizes it's God because he's afraid that he's going to die by seeing God. Humans are not holy in comparison with God. We are quite impure in comparison with God, and as a result, it can be dangerous for us. It can be very bad for our health, so to speak, to come into contact with God. And Isaiah is aware of this, and he says, "Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips and dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips." Now, yes?
Why lips?
That was my next question. Why lips? Okay, good. Isaiah is a prophet, or he's going to become a prophet shortly if he's not a prophet already. And he's going to be commissioned with a message which will make use of his lips. And so it may be his lips in particular that need to be taken care of for him to carry out this assignment from God. Very good. In Zechariah, Joshua is going to be a priest, so when he sees God, God has to change Joshua's clothes so that he can be a priest. Isaiah had to have his lips taken care of so that he could be a prophet. If you read Jeremiah, God touches Jeremiah's mouth to make him a prophet. And Ezekiel has to eat something so that he's able to speak God's words. Isaiah is concerned with his lips like the other prophets. Why else might the lips of Isaiah be a problem? Because he says, I'm a man of unclean lips and I dwell among a people of unclean lips. He's not the only one with a dirty mouth, so to speak. You guys are familiar with this verse, Isaiah 29:13. This people draw near with their mouth and honor me with their lips, while their hearts are far from me, and their fear of me is a commandment taught by men. So one of the problems that Isaiah addresses in his people is that they're hypocritical. They're using their lips in a way that feigns loyalty to God, when in fact their hearts are not loyal to God. And so this may be a particular problem with his lips and with the lips of other people, and that they've pretended to be committed to God when they're not actually committed to God. Good. If he's just as evil as they are, then what right does he have to correct them, or on what basis can he help them out? So he had to be, his own sin had to be dealt with before he could help other people deal with theirs. He had to remove the plank from his lips before he could remove the speck from theirs. I don't think that works, does it? Okay. Yeah, perhaps that's an issue as well. Good. We already talked about God being the King and the Lord of hosts. The last couple of verses that we're dealing with today says, Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for. So God doesn't say, that's all right, don't worry about the lips thing. Happens to everybody except me. Or God doesn't do anything like that. This is a real problem. Isaiah is not simply imagining that he's in danger. He really is in danger. And if the problem is not taken care of, he's going to die. Not only can he not be a prophet, but he would die because he has seen the King, the Lord of hosts, and he has unclean lips, and those things are incompatible in a deadly way. So God deals with it, and one of the seraphs flew to him with in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. Now let's think about this. Where does this coal come from? It comes from the altar. I mean, it's burning. This is something from the altar that has been burning. How does the seraph deliver it to Isaiah's lips? With tongs. Now, why would you take something from an altar with tongs? Okay, it's hot. Even so hot that a seraph wouldn't just reach in there and grab it. He grabs it with tongs, takes it and touches Isaiah's lips. How does that feel to Isaiah? Now, it's interesting. I wish it said this. And Isaiah cried out, or something like that, but we don't have any quotation like that from Isaiah. But presumably this is very hot. If the seraph is grabbing this, it's a burning coal, and he grabs it from the altar with tongs, presumably this is very hot. And I assume that this would have been a very painful experience for Isaiah. It's not an easy purification. It's a painful process of purification. One commentator I read said also, interestingly, that Isaiah is not purified by something that he takes to the altar, but he's purified by the altar itself. And it's not an offering that Isaiah is bringing that is making him pure. It's the altar and something that comes from the altar to him that purifies him. So he touched Isaiah's mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sins atoned for. So God is a great big God, enthroned on a very high throne. His train of his robe fills the temple. He has these strange angels with wings who speak about his holiness and his glory. God is so holy that these seraphs, not even the seraphs who are in God's presence, can bear to look at him. God is holy, and so they cover themselves in God's presence. These are very loud, powerful creatures whose voices shake the doors of the temple. Isaiah is in danger of dying because God is so holy. God is the king, and Isaiah is impure, as his people are impure. This is a really awesome depiction of God. And a question I want to leave you with in anticipation of our study next week is, what kind of commission? Isaiah is getting ready to receive a commission from God. God is going to give Isaiah an assignment. What kind of commission do you expect to come from the God that Isaiah describes? Is this setting you up to think of something that's easy or difficult that Isaiah is going to be assigned to do? Is it going to be something that relates to God's greatness and God's holiness and God's glory, or is it going to relate to some other attribute of God? Pretending for the moment that you haven't read verses 8 through 13, what do you expect God to say to Isaiah? Think about that as we get ready for next week, because next week, if you can imagine this passage getting weirder, it does. And so we're going to talk about that next week. But if you understand the kind of God that Isaiah sees here and the kind of God that speaks to Isaiah, then it may help you to understand that from this God that inspires fear, why God would give an assignment that is really challenging for us as for Isaiah as a prophet, but also for us as God's people. Right. That's a great question. You do have that mentioned in John 4, where it says God is spirit, and those who worship him in spirit and truth. It's a very complicated question. The word spirit in Greek and in Hebrew both is probably doesn't mean spirit in the way we often think of spirit. In the Bible, they do not contrast, for instance, spiritual with physical, the way we do perhaps in modern English. Actually, Brian Bogue is here, and he's getting ready to write a dissertation on heavenly bodies in the Bible, and talk about what sorts of bodies did angels were they believed to have, or what sort of body was God perhaps believed to have. And so he's going to deal with what does it mean to be spirit as opposed to flesh, or flesh as opposed to spirit. And that's the contrast that you have in the Bible. It's not spiritual versus physical, it's spiritual versus fleshly. So you can actually have a body that's a spiritual body, which is what Paul talks about. One day we'll all be given spiritual bodies, or our bodies will be changed so that we're spiritual. So to say that God is spirit doesn't mean that he doesn't have any form whatsoever. It doesn't mean that he's just someone who can pretend to have an appearance on occasion when he wants us to see him, but that he doesn't actually have a form. I think that God does have a body, but it's just not the kind of body that we have. It's spiritual in nature rather than fleshly. So it's not something that happened physically, but something that he just saw or dreamed, or it's not impossible. If that's the case, it would be nice if he were to clarify that. You have an interesting passage in 2 Corinthians 12 where Paul talks about being caught up into the third heaven and seeing God and some other things and hearing things. And he says, well, I don't know whether I was in the body or not. It could have been spiritual or something like that. So you have both kinds of revelation in the Bible. In this case, in the absence of evidence that this was just a vision, I assume that it's something that's really happening. I mean, his lips are touched. So it's not just something that he's seeing, but something that he's hearing and something that he feels. Pardon me? Unless it was a dream. Yeah, and he just dreamed that his lips were touched. That's not impossible. Prophets could do all kinds of crazy stuff. Although he's afraid he's going to die if it's just a dream. I mean, maybe he's dreaming that he's really there, but he's not really there. So in his dream, he's afraid he's going to die, but he's not really. But I assume that he really is in danger of dying, not just dreaming that he is.
But God did do a lot of dramatic things through dreams that impacted people in actual life.
Oh, absolutely. Read the stories of Joseph and Daniel and some others. And absolutely. Great question. Any other questions? All right. Well, I know that you have kids to get, some of you, and I don't want to keep from that. Let me pray real quick, and then I'll look forward to seeing you guys next week. God, forgive us for the times that we think of you as someone who is smaller than you actually are, or as someone who's less holy than you actually are, or less sovereign, less of a king, or less of a Lord of hosts. What Isaiah saw was impressive, God, and my guess is that you're even more impressive than even he realized. But I thank you for the glimpse that you gave him of you, and I thank you that you inspired that what he saw would be written down so that we could learn from it. And I pray that you help us to appreciate just how great you are, and that we would live our lives accordingly. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.